In the middle of the 20th century, a war began that most Americans did not understand when it started and could not forget when it ended. It did not begin with a formal declaration, a clear enemy, or a unified goal. It began quietly, far from American shores, in a country that had already spent decades fighting to free itself from foreign control. What would become the Vietnam War was not born overnight. It was the result of colonial collapse, rising communism, Cold War fear, and a divided nation that never truly chose to be divided. For nearly 100 years, Vietnam was not an independent country. It was part of French Indochina, a colonial territory controlled by France. Beginning in the late 1800s, the French ruled Vietnam for resources, prestige, and power. Vietnamese people were treated as subjects, not citizens. Land was taken, local culture was suppressed, and wealth flowed outward to Europe. Resistance movements formed almost immediately, but they were fragmented and repeatedly crushed. By the early 20th century, Vietnamese nationalism was growing stronger, fueled by the same ideas of self determination that had inspired revolutions elsewhere in the world. Everything changed during World War II. In 1940, as France fell to Nazi Germany, Japan moved into Southeast Asia and occupied Vietnam. The French colonial government remained in place, but it answered to Japan. During this period, famine swept through northern Vietnam, killing over 1 million people. The suffering radicalized the population and strengthened resistance movements. One of those movements was led by Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese revolutionary who combined nationalism with communist ideology. Ho Chi Minh believed Vietnam could only be free by rejecting colonial rule entirely and reorganizing society along socialist lines. During the war against Japan, Ho Chi Minh and his forces, known as the Viet Minh, received limited support from the United States. American intelligence officers worked with them to gather information and fight Japanese forces. At the time, the United States viewed the Viet Minh primarily as anti-Japanese fighters, not as future communist leaders. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation. For a brief moment, it appeared Vietnam might finally gain its freedom. France, however, had no intention of giving up its colony. Determined to reassert control, French forces returned to Vietnam, triggering what became known as the First Indochina War. From 1946 to 1954, the French fought the Viet Minh in a brutal conflict marked by jungle warfare, ambushes, and rising civilian casualties. The war drained France economically and politically. Meanwhile, the global balance of power was shifting. The Cold War had begun, and the United States was increasingly focused on stopping the spread of communism anywhere in the world. As China fell to communism in 1949 and the Korean War erupted in 1950, Vietnam took on new importance in American eyes. U.S. leaders feared that if Vietnam became communist, neighboring countries would soon follow. This idea became known as the domino theory. Although the United States was not officially at war in Vietnam, it began providing France with money, weapons, and military assistance. By the early 1950s, the United States was paying for most of France's war effort in Indochina. The war reached its breaking point in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. French forces stationed in a remote valley believed they could lure the Viet Minh into a decisive confrontation. Instead, the Viet Minh surrounded the base, hauled heavy artillery through jungles and mountains, and bombarded the French position for weeks. When the French finally surrendered, the defeat shocked the world. It marked the end of French colonial ambitions in Vietnam. Later that year, international leaders met in Switzerland to decide Vietnam's future. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The communist-led North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh. The South would be anti-communist and backed by Western powers. The division was meant to be temporary, with nationwide elections scheduled to reunify the country within 2 years. Those elections never happened. The United States feared that Ho Chi Minh would easily win a national vote. Instead of pushing for elections, American leaders supported the creation of a separate South Vietnamese government. Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist and Catholic in a largely Buddhist country, was installed as South Vietnam's leader. His government was corrupt, authoritarian, and deeply unpopular with much of the population. Still, to American policymakers, Diem represented a barrier against communist expansion. At this stage, the United States did not see itself as entering a war. American involvement was described as advisory. Military personnel were sent to train South Vietnamese forces, provide intelligence, and support the government. There were no official combat troops, no formal declaration, and no clear exit strategy, yet the foundations of a much larger conflict were already in place. Vietnam was now divided, tensions were escalating, and both sides believed reunification was inevitable, but on very different terms. What began as a struggle against colonialism was becoming something far more dangerous. The United States was stepping deeper into a conflict shaped by fear, ideology, and assumptions that would soon be tested in ways no one fully anticipated. By the early 1960s, the conflict in Vietnam was no longer just a political standoff. It was turning into a violent struggle for control of the country, and American involvement was steadily increasing. South Vietnam's government, backed by the United States, was losing ground in the countryside. Communist forces were not marching in large armies. Instead, they blended into villages, farms, and jungles, making the war difficult to see and even harder to fight. In South Vietnam, the main communist threat came from the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force made up of South Vietnamese communists supported by the North. They relied on ambushes, sabotage, and hit and run attacks. They knew the terrain, spoke the language, and often lived among civilians. This made it nearly impossible to tell enemy fighters apart from ordinary villagers. South Vietnamese forces struggled to control rural areas, and American advisors increasingly found themselves drawn into direct combat situations, despite the official claim that they were only there to assist. The situation worsened under President John F. Kennedy. While Kennedy did not send large combat units, he dramatically increased the number of American military advisors in Vietnam. Special Forces units trained South Vietnamese troops, conducted counterinsurgency missions, and took part in combat operations. Helicopters became a central part of the war, allowing rapid movement of troops into jungle areas, but also tying American forces more closely to the fighting on the ground. In 1963, South Vietnam plunged into political chaos. President Ngo Dinh Diem's harsh rule, favoritism toward Catholics, and violent repression of Buddhist protests alienated much of the population. As instability grew, the United States quietly supported a military coup. Diem was overthrown and assassinated by South Vietnamese officers. Rather than stabilizing the country, the coup led to years of political instability. A revolving door of weak governments followed, each more dependent on American support than the last. The turning point came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. U.S. officials claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked American destroyers operating off the coast of North Vietnam. While the first encounter did involve a confrontation, later reports were unclear and heavily disputed. Nevertheless, the incident was used to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress. This resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. With congressional approval secured, the war escalated rapidly. In 1965, the first American combat troops landed in Vietnam. What had once been a limited advisory mission became a full-scale war. By the end of the decade, more than 500,000 U.S. troops would be stationed there. American commanders believed that superior firepower and technology could defeat the enemy. The strategy focused on body counts, search and destroy missions, and wearing down the enemy through attrition. The reality on the ground was far different. Vietnam's jungles, rice paddies, and mountains neutralized many technological advantages. Viet Cong fighters used tunnel networks that stretched for miles underground, allowing them to hide, move supplies, and launch surprise attacks. Booby traps were everywhere, punji stakes, tripwires, and hidden explosives that injured or killed soldiers without ever revealing the enemy. Many American casualties came from traps rather than direct firefights. Air power became a defining feature of the war. The United States launched massive bombing campaigns against North Vietnam and enemy supply routes. Napalm was used to clear jungle cover, and Agent Orange was sprayed to strip vegetation and expose enemy positions. These chemicals caused long-term environmental damage and severe health problems for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. Villages were destroyed, farmland was poisoned, and entire regions were left scarred for decades. In January 1968, the war reached a critical moment with the Tet Offensive. During the Vietnamese New Year ceasefire, communist forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, striking cities, military bases, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the North and the Viet Cong. They suffered enormous casualties and failed to spark a popular uprising. Psychologically, however, it was devastating for the United States. For years, American officials had told the public that victory was near. Tet shattered that narrative. Television footage showed intense urban combat, burning cities, and American troops fighting street by street. The public began to question whether the war could be won at all. Trust in government statements collapsed, and opposition to the war surged at home. As the fighting dragged on, American soldiers faced constant stress, confusion, and fear. Many were young draftees with little understanding of why they were there. Morale declined, drug use increased, incidents of friendly fire and breakdowns in discipline became more common. At the same time, Vietnamese civilians were trapped between two sides, suffering displacement, violence, and loss on a massive scale. By the late 1960s, the war had become a stalemate. The United States could win battles, but could not secure lasting control. The enemy refused to surrender, and South Vietnam remained politically fragile. The cost in lives and resources continued to climb, while support for the war at home steadily eroded. America was deeply entrenched in Vietnam, but confidence was fading. What began as a mission to stop communism had turned into a prolonged, brutal conflict with no clear end in sight. The pressure to find a way out was growing, and the war was about to enter its final, most controversial phase. By the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War had reached a breaking point. The United States still possessed overwhelming military power, but victory remained undefined and unreachable. American leaders were facing pressure not from the battlefield alone, but from their own population. The war was no longer distant. It was playing out nightly on television screens, in newspapers, and on college campuses across the country. As casualties mounted, opposition to the war intensified. Massive protests erupted in cities and universities. Students, veterans, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens questioned why American lives were being lost in a conflict with no clear objective. The draft became one of the most divisive issues. Young men were forced into service while others avoided it through deferments or by fleeing the country. The war exposed deep divisions in American society between generations, political beliefs, and views of patriotism itself. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war had consumed his presidency. That same year, Richard Nixon was elected on a promise to bring peace with honor. Nixon knew that a sudden withdrawal could collapse South Vietnam and damage America's global credibility. His solution was a strategy called Vietnamization. Vietnamization aimed to gradually withdraw American troops while transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. U.S. troop levels steadily declined, but the fighting did not stop. To compensate, the United States increased bombing campaigns and expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in an effort to disrupt enemy supply lines. These decisions sparked further outrage at home and destabilized the region even more. Despite ongoing combat, negotiations were underway. Peace talks between the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam dragged on for years. Trust was low, and each side hoped to gain leverage through continued fighting. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American forces, and the return of prisoners of war. For the United States, the war was officially over. American troops came home, but the conflict did not end for Vietnam. Without U.S. military support, South Vietnam struggled to defend itself. Aid was reduced, morale declined, and political corruption continued. North Vietnamese forces, patient and determined, prepared for a final push. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnam launched a full-scale offensive. South Vietnamese defenses collapsed with surprising speed. Cities fell one after another. Refugees flooded the roads. Panic spread as it became clear the war was reaching its final moments. The last days were marked by chaos. Helicopters lifted off from rooftops in Saigon, evacuating American personnel and some South Vietnamese allies. Thousands were left behind. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon. The South Vietnamese government surrendered. Vietnam was reunified under communist control. The war left scars that would last for generations. More than 58,000 Americans were killed. Millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Vast areas of land were devastated. Chemical agents continued to affect health and the environment long after the fighting stopped. For American veterans, coming home was often painful. Many were met not with gratitude, but with silence or hostility. Psychological trauma, later recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, went largely untreated. The nation struggled to process what the war had meant and whether it had achieved anything at all. Politically, Vietnam reshaped how the United States approached future conflicts. Trust in government was damaged. Congress moved to limit presidential war powers. Military strategy shifted toward avoiding prolonged ground wars without clear goals and public support. The Vietnam War did not end with a victory parade or a clear resolution. It ended with lessons learned at enormous cost. It remains one of the most complex and controversial chapters in modern history, a war that began quietly, escalated rapidly, and ended in a way that forced an entire nation to reflect on power, purpose, and the human cost of war. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.